How can we search for knowledge if we do not already know what we are looking for? If we already know, then inquiry is unnecessary because we already possess the knowledge of it. But if we do not know it, the inquiry seems impossible. This is known as Meno's paradox. Consider a sentence, I believe that Pegasus exists. Notice one thing here. Grammar is deceiving us about reality. Mathematics here is placed in the court to prove the ultimate validity of its theorem, and it has no answer other than saying if the hypotheses are given, then by the laws of deduction, the conclusion will follow necessarily from the premises. Hello, Namaskar, Adab, Vanakkam. Alfred North Whitehead once wrote, the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. Ralph Waldo Emerson went even further and expressed even more emphatic judgment that philosophy is Plato and Plato philosophy. However, Karl Popper finds that Plato's best state is based on the most rigid class distinction. In other words, it is a caste state, and that Plato's political program can be fairly described as totalitarian. Whitehead's, Emerson's and Popper's comments present two radically different assessments of Plato's legacy and reveal the dual nature of his scholarship, which has influenced Western philosophy throughout history. In our lecture today, I will examine Plato's theory of knowledge through three major dialogues, the Republic, the Meno and Theaetetus. We will begin with the Republic. Here, Plato distinguishes knowledge from opinion and asks what kind of reality can be properly known. This will lead us to the theory of forms, the divided line and the allegory of the cave. We will then turn to the Meno. In that dialogue, Plato considers a basic problem. How can we search for knowledge if we do not know what we are looking for? Let me repeat that again. How can we search for knowledge if we do not already know what we are looking for? This is known as Meno's paradox. Plato responds with the theory of recollection, which is a very famous theory, and develops an important distinction between true belief and knowledge. Finally, in the third section, we will examine Theaetetus. Here, the inquiry into knowledge becomes more analytical. Plato asks whether knowledge can be defined, and he tests several possible answers. So, let's begin with the Republic. One central concern of Plato's philosophy across his dialogues, including the Republic, is an ethical question. How should a human being live a just and a good life? For Plato, however, answering that question requires an inquiry into justice and goodness themselves. Before we can say how a person ought to live, we need to know what justice and goodness are. We also need to ask what kind of reality they have. This is why Plato does not sharply distinguish or separate ethics, epistemology, and metaphysics. How one ought to live depends on what one knows, and what one knows depends on what is real. For this reason, questions about knowledge become central in books 5 to 7 of the Republic. In book 5, Plato distinguishes philosophers from non-philosophers. Non-philosophers are drawn to many beautiful sights, sounds, and actions or objects that they encounter in ordinary life. They can recognize beautiful things, just actions, or goodness in particular things. But Plato says that they do not grasp beauty itself, justice itself, or goodness itself. The philosopher, on the other hand, seeks a deeper understanding of reality and loves truth. The philosopher wants to apprehend beauty itself, or justice itself, the goodness itself. Plato therefore says that philosopher loves truth and seeks what truly exists, or the being itself. This contrast leads Plato to distinguish knowledge, or episteme, from opinion, or it is called doxa in Greek. And this difference between knowledge and opinion is explained by connecting each to a specific state of mind and its specific object. Knowledge is directed toward what fully is. Ignorance is directed toward what is not. Opinion occupies a position between what is and what is not. Why does Plato say this? Because for him, the sensible things are unstable. Consider a particular beautiful object, for example. It may be beautiful in one respect but ugly in another. An action may appear just in one context but unjust in another. Sensible things, that are the things we encounter through sight, sound, and ordinary experience, can therefore appear to have qualities depending on circumstances. Therefore, in simple terms, knowledge requires an object that is stable and does not change through time. For Plato, this means that sensible things do not provide the stable object required for knowledge. They can be beautiful and ugly, just and unjust, large and small, depending on the comparison or context here. They belong, therefore, to the domain of opinion rather than full knowledge. The philosopher recognizes the many beautiful things that appear in ordinary experience. At the same time, the philosopher seeks the principle that makes them beautiful and aims to understand beauty itself. To understand beauty, one must look beyond individual examples and seek beauty itself, that is, the form of beauty. At this point, we need to clarify one important phrase. What does Plato mean by what is? There are three major interpretations: predicative, second is existential interpretation, and third is veridical. On the predicative reading, knowledge concerns the forms, which means what is beautiful, what is just, what is equal, or what is good in itself. Opinion concerns the many sensible things that can appear both beautiful and ugly, just and unjust, equal and unequal. On the existential reading, knowledge concerns what fully exists. Opinion concerns sensible things which occupy an intermediate position between being and not being, that is, what is and what is not. On the veridical reading, knowledge and opinion directed towards propositions. Knowledge concerns what is true, while opinion may be either true or false. The veridical reading fits specially well with the distinction between knowledge and belief in the Meno and Theaetetus. The Republic, however, is more often read through the predicative and existential reading. When we move from a distinction between knowledge and opinion, we arrive at theory of forms, Plato's most famous theory. Plato gives one of the clearest accounts of the forms in the Phaedo, but they are also central to understanding epistemology in the Republic. Pay attention to this. As we know, knowledge requires a stable and unchanging object. That is why the changing entities of sense experience cannot be its proper objects. What we perceive through senses does not fully meet the condition of stability. Therefore, if knowledge is to be possible, if we are to know anything, its objects must be something other than sensible particulars. Plato calls these unchanging and eternal realities the forms. A form is an intelligible reality that remains the same even when the things we see and touch change. Forms are outa kath hauta, which means they exist in and of themselves. Let me repeat that again. Forms are outa kath hauta, which means they exist in and of themselves. In the affinity argument of the Phaedo, Plato explains how forms differ from the things we experience through the senses, which he calls sensible particulars. Forms are simple, indivisible, unchanging. Sensible particulars, on the other hand, are composite, divisible, and always changing. For example, there are many beautiful things, but beauty itself never becomes ugly. It exists in its own right. In the same way, there are many just actions, but justice itself never becomes unjust. Always remain the same, the forms, they always remain the same. Particular things are beautiful or just because they share in the form of beauty or form of justice. Because of this, forms are true objects of knowledge, while sensible particulars are the objects of opinion or belief. Why? Because they change. Very simple. The theory of forms argues that forms are the deepest causes and ultimate explanations of why things are as they are. However, for Plato, forms such as beauty, justice, and equality are not the highest things that we can know. In the book 6 of the Republic, Socrates introduces the form of the good as the highest object of knowledge. The form of the good is the principle that makes the other forms intelligible and gives the mind the capacity to know. Here Socrates compares the good to the sun. Just as the sun both sustains and illuminates visible things, allowing eye to see, the form of the good makes it possible for us to understand and know the forms. In this sense, good is the cause of both knowledge and truth. It is the highest object of knowledge. This comparison between sun and the good leads to Plato's analogy of the divided line in book 6 of the Republic. In the divided line, Plato organizes reality and cognition into a hierarchical structure. He shows that how different levels of reality correspond to different states of mind. In this, Plato invites us to consider a line divided into two main sections. The lower section represents the visible world, which is accessible through sensory perception. The visible world is itself divided further. At the lowest level are the images or shadows or reflections and similar appearances. These corresponds to the state of imagination, or in Greek it is called eikasia, E-I-K-A-S-I-A. Above this level are the physical objects, which are the ordinary things that we perceive and handle. These objects corresponds to belief or pistis. Belief is higher than imagination because it is directed toward actual sensible objects rather than mere appearances. What are the objects? Like table, chairs, mountains, and rivers. Nevertheless, belief remains restricted to the visible world. It therefore concerns objects that are subject to change and instability. The upper section of the divided line represents intelligible world, which is the domain of thought and genuine understanding. Plato divides this world into two separate levels again. The lower level concerns with mathematical objects. In this domain, the mind reasons from hypotheses. These are assumed starting points such as mathematical definitions and principles and deduces conclusions from them. This mode of cognition is what Plato calls diaonia, or discursive reasoning. Mathematical reasoning moves beyond the visible objects of ordinary experience and concerns intelligible structures. I can call that structures of reason. Still, it begins from hypothesis that it does not itself fully justify. Above this level, which is the highest level, where the mind focuses on the forms themselves, and in the end on an ultimate unhypothetical first principle, that is the form of the good. This is noesis, or understanding. Understanding is the highest form of knowing because it does not simply reason from hypotheses like in Dionia, the mathematical reasoning. Rather, it seeks the eternal, intelligible principle that makes knowledge possible. How does Plato think that we reach this highest level? His answer is through the dialectical method, that is, the rational ascent from hypothesis towards an unhypothetical first principle and ultimately towards the form of the good. In practical terms, it is, and I quote, a cooperative inquiry carried on in conversation between two or more minds that are equally bent not on getting the better of the argument, but on arriving at the truth. Plato's well-known allegory of the cave in Book 7 of the Republic gives a concrete picture of this ascent that the divided line describes in theory. The divided line presents different levels of reality and cognition. The cave shows what it is like for a person to move from opinion towards actual knowledge. Inside the cave, prisoners, now imagine this, inside the cave, prisoners are chained so that they can only see shadows on a wall cast by objects behind them. Since they have never seen anything else other than the shadows, they take these shadows to be real. For them, the reality are only the shadows. Pay attention to the point of this image. The prisoners take appearances to be reality itself. This situation represents the lowest level of cognition, in which people confuse images with the truth. When one prisoner is freed and turns towards the fire and objects that produce these shadows, he feels pain and confusion. This marks the shift from images towards the objects that lie behind them. The mind begins to look beyond appearances, these mere shadows, although it has not yet reached the understanding. As the prisoner leaves the cave, his eyes gradually become accustomed to the light, namely the sun. He first sees reflections, then real objects, and finally the sun, as I said. This journey represents soul's path towards true knowledge. It culminates in the vision of the form of the good. This now brings us to the end of our discussion of the Republic. In this work, Plato outlines a structure of knowledge in which opinion deals with the changing world of our appearances, the sensible particulars. True knowledge, on the other hand, aims at the unchanging reality of the forms and ultimately the good. Next, we will turn to the Meno, where Plato asks a related question: how is learning possible at all? Like the Republic, the Meno begins with a practical and ethical question. The main concern is whether virtue can be taught or acquired through practice, or whether it comes by nature. Socrates quickly changes the discussion. Before we can ask whether virtue can be taught, we must first know what virtue is. Pretty obvious, right? Or otherwise, we do not yet know what we are asking about. This leads to one of Plato's central problems about knowledge, the problem of inquiry, often known as Meno's paradox. The paradox is this: suppose we want to inquire into something. There seems to be only two possibilities about this. Either we already know the thing we are looking for, or we do not know it. If we already know, then inquiry is unnecessary because we already possess the knowledge of it. But if we do not know it, the inquiry seems impossible. How could we search for something if we do not know what it is? And even if we found the answer, how would we know that this is what we were looking for? Notice the force of the problem. Inquiry appears to be trapped between two alternatives. If we know what we are looking for, there is no need to search. If we do not know what we are looking for, we cannot begin the search at all. In a more formal form, the paradox can be stated in this way. For any object of inquiry x, either one knows x or one does not know x. If one knows x, then inquiry into x is unnecessary because one already has the knowledge of it. If one does not know x, then the inquiry into x is impossible because one would not know what to search for or how to recognize the answer even if one found it. Therefore, inquiry is either unnecessary or impossible. Notice how Plato responds to this Meno's paradox. He does so by introducing the theory of recollection, also called anamnesis. This is also a very famous theory of Plato. Socrates argues that learning is in fact a process of recollecting, remembering in a way. This basic idea is that inquiry can begin from a position somewhere between complete knowledge and total ignorance. We may not fully know what we are seeking, but we can have partial beliefs, questions, or starting points that can guide the inquiry. In this way, Plato aims to show that learning is possible, even though Meno's paradox seems to make it impossible. The theory of recollection is resting on a further claim. Plato here presupposes that soul existed before the embodiment of life and possessed the knowledge of the forms prior to birth. When the soul enters the body, it forgets this knowledge. Learning, therefore, is the recovery of knowledge that is already latent within the soul, that was already previously was there in the soul but forgotten once the person is born. It is the process of bringing forgotten truth back into awareness through process of philosophical questioning. This idea became important much later in the history of philosophy, especially for the theories of innate ideas. Descartes, for example, goes on to argue that some ideas are not derived from sense experience alone. That was the impact of innate theories, innate knowledge. Coming back to our main discussion, Meno challenges Socrates to demonstrate this theory, the theory of recollection. Socrates responds by questioning an enslaved boy about a geometrical problem. The boy has never studied geometry, know this. Still, Socrates guides him through a series of questions until he reaches the answer through his own reasoning. Let us look at the problem carefully. Socrates begins with a square whose sides are 2 feet long. Each is 2 feet long. Its area therefore is 4 square feet. It's pretty obvious. He then asks the boy how to construct a square with twice that area, that is square of 8 square feet. The boy's first answer is double the side length, but square with the sides of 4 feet has an area of 16 square feet, but we want square of 8 square feet. He then suggests a square with sides of 3 feet, but that produces an area of 9 square feet. That is also a wrong answer. Socrates keeps asking questions and shows that boy is wrong, which confuses the boy. Socrates then uses a diagram to show that diagonal of the original square provides the sides of a new square whose area is exactly 8 square feet. For Plato, this demonstration shows that the boy can know geometrical truth through reasoning, even though he had never been taught geometry or the theorems. Socrates takes this as evidence that learning involves some kind of recollection. The demonstration also gives Plato an answer to Meno's paradox, the challenge that Meno posed. This response appears to satisfy Meno. After the geometrical demonstration that Socrates showed with the enslaved boy, the dialogue returns to its original question, that is, can virtue be taught? At this point, Socrates proceeds by hypothesis. If virtue is knowledge, then virtue should be teachable. But this immediately raises a further question. If virtue is teachable knowledge, who is teaching it? Can the sophist teach virtue? A new character now enters the discussion in the dialogue. His name is Anytus. Now remember, Anytus is the person who was the main prosecutor of Socrates in his trial, but that's another story. Anytus rejects the claim that sophist can teach virtue. He rejects that. However, he says that respectable older citizens can educate the young in virtue. Notice what Socrates challenges here. It's very interesting. He questions the assumption that social respectability, old age, or a good public reputation is enough to establish that someone can teach virtue. We will still hear this version in our society today. Even today, I will say. Older generations sometimes say that the young, whether millennials or Gen Z, lack culture or susanskar. But Socrates raises more difficult question. Even when elderly people themselves are respected, have they actually succeeded in cultivating virtue in the next generation? To test Anytus's claim that older people can teach virtue to the young, Socrates refers to the prominent Athenian politicians, including Themistocles, Aristides, Pericles, and Thucydides. These men were regarded as great and very much virtuous. Yet, Socrates argues that they failed to make their own sons virtuous in the same way. This reputation provokes Anytus, and he leaves the conversation. Socrates then continues the discussion with Meno alone. Since the claim that virtue is knowledge has been challenged, Socrates considers a new possibility. Perhaps it is possible people can act correctly through a cognitive state that is not complete knowledge, but that still guides action effectively. Plato calls this state orthodoxa. Let me repeat that again. It is orthodoxa. It is usually translated as a right opinion or correct belief or true belief. Okay, orthodoxa is a true belief, a correct opinion. If you have heard someone say that people are orthodox, it basically means that they have a right opinion or belief, which they hold sometimes dogmatically. In this, orthos means right, plus doxa means opinion. Socrates explains the difference between true belief and knowledge through the example of route to Larissa, an ancient city in Thessaly, which was also Meno's homeland. He describes two situations, one in which a person knows the route to the city Larissa, while another has only true belief about the route. Both can successfully guide the travelers. Notice immediate implication here. True belief serves the same practical purpose as knowledge. A person may act correctly and succeed even without possessing knowledge in the full sense. This helps Socrates explain how people may act virtuously even when they cannot teach virtue to others. They may hold correct beliefs about what ought to be done, and those beliefs may guide their actions. However, this does not follow that true belief is as valuable as knowledge in every respect. It is in the Meno that Plato gives one of his earliest and most influential discussions of the difference between true belief and knowledge. Now this is going to get very interesting. According to him, the key difference is stability. Remember this. He compares true beliefs to the statues of Daedalus. He was an ancient sculptor. These statues were said to be so lifelike that if they were left untied, they would run away. That was the belief in those people. But once they were tied down, they would remain in place. True beliefs are similar to the statues of Daedalus. A true belief can guide action successfully. It can lead someone to the right destination, just as the example of the road to Larissa city showed. But A true belief may also be unstable. A person may later abandon that belief, forget about it, or just persuade it out of it. Notice what makes the difference. A true belief becomes secure when it is tied down by an explanation of why that belief is true. Socrates calls this aetias logismos, that is, an account or explanation or reasoning why the belief is true. Once true belief is tied down in this way, Socrates says that knowledge becomes possible. In logical form, this view can be reconstructed in the following way. You know that P if and only if. First, you believe that P. Second, P is true. And third, you can give an aetias logismos or explanatory account why P is true. This third condition, aetias logismos, later became known as justification and later became important in the discussion of knowledge as justified true belief. But the connection must be stated carefully here. On one interpretation, aetias logismos in the Meno means working out the explanation of something rather than assembling a justification of it. On this reading, the enslaved boy may have correct beliefs and may even have some rational support for them. Still, he lacks knowledge because his beliefs have not fully settled through explanatory understanding. So, on this interpretation, Plato does not straightforwardly define knowledge as justified true belief. That was the first interpretation. Another interpretation accepts the criticism of weak justification, but argues that Plato can still belong within the broader justified true belief tradition, provided that justification is understood more strongly. On this view, Plato requires explanatory justification. Knowledge is true belief secured by an account that explains why the belief is true. The debate, therefore, is not whether Plato connects knowledge with true belief and an account, but what kind of account is required. A weak form of justification is insufficient. The stronger reading understands aetias logismos as explanatory account that ties true belief down to knowledge. Coming back to our main discussion, the Meno here leaves with an important result. True belief can successfully guide action, as the road to Larissa example shows. But true belief becomes knowledge only when it is tied down by an explanatory account, what Socrates calls aetias logismos. This brings us directly to the central problem of the Theaetetus. What exactly is knowledge? Theaetetus is Plato's most direct and analytical investigation into the nature of knowledge. Just like the earlier dialogues, Meno, Theaetetus also discusses the virtue and wise people, which leads Socrates to an epistemological question. This kind of theme is recurrent in Plato's other dialogues as well. Socrates discusses the question of what is knowledge or episteme with Theaetetus, who is a young mathematician, and his teacher Theodoros. So there are two characters, Theaetetus and his teacher Theodoros. Theaetetus, the dialogue, was written around 369 BCE and it is widely regarded as one of Plato's most important works in epistemology. Before we go directly into the arguments of the dialogue, it is important to highlight an interesting debate. In Theaetetus, Plato does not rely on his famous theory of forms as he does in many of his other works, such as the Republic, as we have seen. This has led an important debate on how to read Theaetetus. The debate is between two readings, two interpretations. One is Unitarian reading and the second is Revisionism. Unitarians believe that Plato still assumes the broader metaphysical framework of the forms even though he does not state it explicitly in the dialogue. On the other hand, Revisionism claims that something radical has happened when Plato was discussing or writing Theaetetus. Something radical that Theaetetus marks a turning point in Plato's thought. Plato is said to have examined knowledge without relying on the earlier two worlds framework of forms and sensible particulars. We do not need to settle that debate here. I was just giving you a hint. For our purposes, we shall consider Theaetetus as Plato's most direct analytical investigation into the nature of knowledge itself. It asks whether knowledge can be understood as perception or true belief accompanied by some logos or account. Notice that in Theaetetus, the aetios logismos has become logos. In the dialogue, when Socrates questions about the nature of knowledge, Theaetetus first responds to Socrates' question by giving examples. He says that geometry, astronomy, shoemaking, etc. are forms of knowledge, which is very intuitive. But Socrates takes objection. Notice why he does so. Theaetetus, the character, has identified several areas in which knowledge appears, that is, shoemaking, etc. But he has not yet explained what knowledge itself is. To list instances or examples of knowledge is not to define knowledge. This is one of Socrates' central methodological demands. A genuine definition for him must identify the common feature shared by all instances of the thing being defined. For example, listing triangles, squares and circles does not define geometrical figure what it is. In the same way, listing geometry, astronomy, shoemaking does not tell us what knowledge is. If you are not understood, let me repeat that again. Listing examples such as triangles, squares and circle does not define geometrical figure what itself is. In the same way, listing geometry, astronomy and shoemaking does not define knowledge itself. In logical terms, Socrates' objection can be said as follows. For every x and every y, if y is an instance of x, then y does not define x. This objection seems to satisfy Theaetetus and leads him to give first definition of knowledge. We can call that definition D1, and that is knowledge is perception. Here perception includes sensation such as sight, hearing, smell, heat and cold. It also includes experiences such as pleasure, pain, desire and fear. So Theaetetus means that what one knows is what one perceives through the senses. Socrates immediately connects this definition with two important doctrines of his time. One is Protagoras and second is Heraclitus. The first is Protagoras' famous doctrine of homo mensura, that is, man is the measure of all things. Let me quote that again. Man is the measure of all things. The second is Heraclitean doctrine that all things are in motion or flux, or they change constantly. If you have heard someone say change is the only constant, that goes back to Heraclitus. Notice Plato's strategy here. If knowledge is perception, then what appears to each person must be true for that person. And if reality is always in motion, according to Heraclitus, then what person perceives may change as the object of perception change. Therefore, Plato treats Theaetetus' first definition as closely connected with Protagorean theory of appearance and Heraclitean theory of flux. If these connected doctrines cannot be defended, then the definition of knowledge as perception cannot be maintained either. That is Plato's strategy to refute that definition. Therefore, Plato's goal is to refute the claims of Protagoras and Heraclitus. Protagoras' thesis, that is, man is the measure of all things, is also called homo mensura, by the way, claims that perception gives us infallible knowledge of what we perceive. What appears to each person is true for that person. In other words, the things in perception are how they are, and the things that are not, how they are not. In philosophical jargon, for Protagoras, appearance and truth for the person are extensionally equivalent. That is, whatever appears to me is true for me, and whatever appears to you is true for you. In formal language, it is as follows. 1. If it seems to a person X that P, then it is true for X that P. Second, if it is true for X that P, then it seems to X that P. Therefore, it seems to X that P is equivalent with it is true for X that P. To clarify Protagorean position, Socrates introduces what is known as the cold wind argument. Suppose that same wind blows on you and me, two people. It feels cold to me but not you. So the question is the wind itself cold or not? Notice the difficulty. There is one physical object, that is the wind itself, yet two different perceptual experiences that arise from it. Coldness for me and warmth, or at least the absence of coldness for you. In this argument, Socrates introduces a distinction between the sense object and the physical object. There are two different sense objects, that is the feeling of cold to me and warmth to you. However, there is only one physical object, that is the wind itself. Now, the question here appears, how is it possible that the same physical object has two separate sense objects? That is the wind itself cold or it is not? Given Protagoras represent the relativism of knowledge, it is generally considered that he believed the wind is both cold and warm at the same time. However, according to the law of contradiction, it is contradictory. But Protagoras avoids this contradiction by relativizing the property to the perceiver. To support Protagoras' relativism, Socrates provides an ontological basis for this position by connecting his doctrine to Heraclitean doctrine of radical flux. The idea is that sensible objects always seem to change. They are always changing, and that perception arises through an interaction between the perceiver and the perceived object. In this account, there are two kinds of motion. Firstly, the object has an active capacity to affect something, which Plato calls poiein. Secondly, the perceiver has passive capacity to be affected, which Plato calls passion. Let me repeat that again. There are two kinds of motion. First, the object which has an active capacity to affect something, and the perceiver which has a passive capacity to be affected. Okay, poiein and passion. Because these two motions are generated uniquely in the exact moment of your interaction between perceiver and the perceived object, they are entirely private to the individual perceiver. Coldness, warmth, color, and other perceivable qualities arise through this interaction. Again, the interaction between perceived object and the perceiver. They are generated in the encounter between object and the perceiver. Consider the wind again. The same wind may produce coldness in one person and warmth in another because different perceptual events arise in different perceivers. The coldness that appears to me and the warmth that appears to you are not fixed qualities existing in the wind independently of every act of perception. This is why perception appears infallible in Protagorean thesis. Whatever appears to a person is true for that person at that moment. But notice the difficulty this creates in Plato's conception of knowledge. If everything involved in perception is always changing, then knowledge no longer appears to have stability Plato usually requires. Now, one point requires our attention here, that throughout his dialogues, Plato opposes Protagoras' relativism. When Plato criticizes Protagoras in Theaetetus, he is also challenging broader view of relativism in moral and political judgment. Protagoras' moral and political judgment. This is because Protagoras' major thesis goes beyond sensory perception to include value judgments about law and justice. Coming back to our main discussion, now let's look at the refutation of the first definition that we have called D1. Criticism of D1, that knowledge is perception, develops through several objections. We will consider only major 5 objections. There are around 12 objections, but we are only considering 5, the major ones. In these 5 objections, the first few argument concerns Plato's criticism of Protagoras. After this, we will then turn to Plato's objection of Heraclitean doctrine of change and flux. Finally, we will examine Plato's direct attack on Theaetetus' first definition, that is, knowledge is perception. Let us begin with the first objection. The first objection is that if all perceptions are true, then there seems to be no basis for saying that human perceptions are better than animal perceptions, and Socrates does not accept this consequence. Second objection is very much related to the first that we just saw. If whatever person perceives is true for that person, then no one can be wiser than anyone else. Every person's judgment becomes equally true. Socrates therefore questions this further. Why should a doctor's judgment be followed over a judgment of an ordinary person who is sick? If patient's perception is true for the patient, then there seems to be no special reason to prefer doctor's opinion. This creates a serious problem for Protagoras. Let me repeat that again. If everybody's perception is true for that person, then there is no way to find out whose perception is true. And we should not even concern talking to the doctor if patient's perception is equally true as compared to doctors. His position appears to leave no room for wisdom, expertise, and physician's judgment. However, Protagoras introduces a value pragmatic criterion in order to preserve the distinction between wisdom and ignorance. In Protagoras' defense, wise people such as sophists himself, teachers and doctors are not concerned with changing false belief into true ones. In his view, all beliefs are true for the person who has them. The wise person instead brings about change from worst state of appearance to a better one. Notice the shift here. Protagoras moves the criterion away from the truth, seeking truth, towards seeking benefits. Wise teacher uses arguments or logi in the same way doctor uses medicines. Isn't that fantastic? The doctor changes the body from bad condition to a good one. In the same way, the teacher uses discourse to bring soul from a worst state of appearance to a better state. So, even though all beliefs are true for the person who has them, Protagoras can still say some beliefs, experiences, some state of appearances are more beneficial and valuable than other appearances. Here, Protagoras answers by shifting the criteria from truth to benefit by giving wisdom a therapeutic role. Now, interestingly, a careful and a distant comparison can be made with later Wittgenstein's philosophy. Wittgenstein describes philosophy in therapeutic terms, though in a very different sense. In his Tractatus, his most famous book, Wittgenstein developed a highly structured account of propositions, truth, and the limits of meaningful language. In his philosophical investigations, however, he treats many philosophical problems as confusions produced by our misuse of language. He writes, "The philosopher's treatment of questions is like a treatment of an illness." Our third objection is called Peritropê. The word Peritropê means table turning, and the strategy here is to turn the argument back against itself. Here, Plato argues that Protagoras' relativist doctrine is self-refuting. This is probably the most famous objection to man-measure doctrine of Protagoras. In this, he wants to show that if Protagoras applies his theory universally, he will also have to accept the validity of others' belief that contradicts his own. The argument is as follows. Protagoras says that all beliefs are true for the person who has them. Second, some people believe that Protagoras' doctrine is false. Third, now as per Protagoras' own doctrine, that belief is true for those people. Fourth, Therefore, Protagoras must accept that his own doctrine is false for those people. Therefore, his theory loses universal authority and refutes itself. Notice the force of the argument. If every person is a measure of truth, then those who judge Protagoras' doctrine to be false are also correct, at least for themselves. Therefore, Protagoras must grant validity of their judgment, but then his own doctrine loses its claim to universal authority. After this criticism of Protagorean relativism, Socrates turns in the fourth objection to Heraclitus, Heraclitus' doctrine of flux. This doctrine provides a metaphysical grounding for the claim that knowledge is perception. According to Heraclitean thesis of radical flux, everything is in constant change. But if everything is always changing, then stable predication becomes impossible. Even the statement "this is green" becomes unstable. The subject "this," the predicate is green, and the relation between the subject and the predicate are always changing. The problem is that theory of total flux undermines the very language required to express it. If Heraclitus' doctrine is true, then no stable statement can be made about anything, which includes the statement "knowledge is perception," because that statement too would be changing. The Heraclitean doctrine therefore undermines the stable foundation required for knowledge. In our fifth and final objection, Socrates directly targets the definition D1, that is, knowledge is perception. Socrates argues that sense perception by itself does not provide the concepts that the mind uses to make perception intelligible. Concepts such as being, sameness, and difference are not seen, touched, tasted in the sense perception. In other words, they are not objects of perception. However, they are common to all objects of that perception. The mind is acquainted with these common notions, are called Quine also in Greek, through its own activity rather than through a sensory interaction between the senses and its external objects. From this, Socrates argues that some elements of judgments are not given in sense perception. Therefore, knowledge cannot be perception. One important clarification is required here for us to understand this further. Plato's common notions, or Quine in Greek, are common in the sense that they apply to any number of individual things. They should not be confused with Aristotle's common sense, or koine aesthesis, which is the faculty that unifies the different perceptual sensations. For example, for Plato, common notions of being applies to all that is in existence, whereas Aristotle says that the common sense is a faculty that unifies all the five senses. Notice the conclusion Socrates now draws from the common notions. We are now coming back to our main discussions of Theaetetus. Knowledge is not an immediate sensory awareness. Rather, it arises from mind's reflections on those awareness of sensory perception. Now, this leads Theaetetus to see that knowledge is not to be found in perception, but somewhere above from the perception in the field of thought or judgment. This shows the link between Plato's Theaetetus and the linguistic aspects of his knowledge, of his theory of knowledge. With this result in view, Theaetetus now offers a second definition. We can call that definition D2, and the definition is knowledge is true belief, or knowledge is true judgment. Once Theaetetus introduces this definition, Socrates immediately raises a problem of false belief. If knowledge is true belief, then we need to understand what false belief is. More precisely, we need to ask whether false belief is possible at all. This is why possibility of false belief becomes a central issue under the second definition. Socrates examines several attempts to explain how a person can believe something falsely. However, it is the failure to show how false belief is possible that leads to the demise of the second definition, that knowledge is true judgment. Let's see how that goes. The process of finding false belief plays out in 5 different ways as follows. First, false belief as misidentifying a thing for another thing. Second, false belief as believing what is not. Third, false belief as other judgment. Fourth, mind as a wax tablet. 5, mind as an aviary model. Let's start with the first one. The first suggestion for explaining false belief is misidentification. In this, false belief occurs when the mind mistakes one thing for another thing. For example, I might see someone from a distance and judge that is Amitabh Bachchan when it is actually Dharmendra. In simple terms, I judge that X is Y even though X and Y are distinct. However, Socrates shows the problem with this explanation. If I know both Amitabh Bachchan and Dharmendra, how could I confuse one with the other? If I know only one of them, how could I judge one is the other? And if I know neither of them, how could I make any judgment about them at all? So, whether I know both of them or one of them or neither of them, Socrates argues that misidentification cannot explain false belief is possible. Coming to our second suggestion, that examines false belief through problem of non-being or thinking what is not. This is one of the most famous and interesting problems in philosophy. Here, false belief is understood as believing or judging what is not. Let me say that again. False belief is understood as believing or judging what is not. In Greek, this is ta me onta, which means the things that are not. The difficulty is this. If what is not means nothing, then false belief seems to have no object. But whenever a person believes, that person believes something. Believing appears to require an object or content before the mind. Therefore, false belief is belief about nothing. It collapses into having no belief at all. Notice the assumption made behind this argument. The mind can judge only what is, in some sense, available to thought. But if what is not is treated as nothing, then it cannot be thought or judged. Therefore, under this assumption, false belief again appears impossible. At this point, let us consider an interesting criticism of Plato's attempt to demonstrate impossibility of false belief. We can use Quine's logic, especially from his essay on what there is, his 1948 essay, to see where Plato's argument may go wrong. Quine would say that Plato is working with the assumption that false belief must be directed toward an object, namely the object what is not, object nothing, rather than toward a false proposition. For Quine, false belief is not a relation between the mind and the strange object called non-being, because false belief is better analyzed in terms of sentences, predicates, quantifiers, and truth conditions. So, instead of saying false belief is thinking what is not, a Quinean analysis would say a false belief is when a person assents to a sentence whose truth conditions are not satisfied. Consider a sentence, I believe that Pegasus exists. Notice one thing here. Grammar is deceiving us about reality. The sentence contains the name Pegasus and therefore appears to require Pegasus as an object which I am thinking. However, Quine's point is that surface grammar should not determine our ontology. The fact that sentence contains a name does not show that there must be an object corresponding to that name. Therefore, the content of the belief can be expressed through an existential claim. It goes as follows. There exists some x such that x is Pegasus. However, this existential claim is false. Here, truth condition fails because nothing satisfies predicate is Pegasus, or in Quinean language, nothing Pegasizes. So we can explain false belief through ontologically committing ourselves to Pegasus as an object. The subject believes an existential sentence, but the world does not contain anything that makes that sentence true, because the sentence is only quantificational structure rather than an object oriented relation. In this way, Quine's logical analysis cuts through what he famously calls Plato's beard, that is, tangled doctrine of non-being that has long been dulling the edge of Occam's razor. Coming to our third suggestion, that is known as other judgment or allodoxia. Here Plato moves beyond the problem of non-being. Now, instead of saying that false belief is thinking what is not, he suggests that false belief occurs when the mind judges one thing to be another thing. For example, I may judge something ugly to be beautiful or something beautiful to be ugly. Notice that in this case, false belief concerns an interchange between one of the things that are and some other things that are. Beautiful with ugly, for example, or for example, a cat with a dog. However, Plato criticizes this proposal through his account of judging as silent speech. He defines judging as the mind's conversation with itself. So, if someone falsely judging the ugly to be beautiful, it seems as though in their mind they are saying the ugly is beautiful or the cat is dog. Plato finds this absurd, because if the mind clearly has both ugly and beautiful or cat and dog before itself, why would it identify one with the other? So, the third attempt, namely allodoxia, again appears to show that false belief is not possible. Coming now to our fourth attempt, that is known as the puzzle of the wax tablet, which is closely connected with memory as a faculty of the mind. Here Socrates asks us to imagine a block of wax as if it were mind. Now remember this, here the mind is a wax tablet, okay? Just as a seal or a stamp is pressed into wax, similarly our perceptions leave impressions on the mind. Later, when we perceive something, the mind tries to match the present perception with an earlier memory imprint. So, a false belief occurs when the mind makes an incorrect match between a present perception and a memory imprint. For example, I may have a memory imprint of Amitabh Bachchan and Dharmendra, but when I see Amitabh Bachchan from a distance, I may wrongly attach that present perception of Amitabh Bachchan to the memory imprint of Dharmendra. I then judge that I am seeing Dharmendra. Notice the structure of the error here. False belief arises from a mistaken linkage between the present perception of Amitabh Bachchan and memory imprint of Dharmendra. But again, this attempt explains the possibility of false belief also fails. It ends in failure. The wax tablet model mainly explains mistakes involving sensory perception and memory. However, it cannot fully explain purely intellectual errors such as arithmetic mistakes, where no present perception is matched with a memory imprint. For example, someone may wrongly think that 1 plus 1 is 11. Since 1 plus 1 is 2, this amounts to thinking that 11 is true. Now, notice this problem. Now, to address the problem of arithmetic error left unresolved by the wax tablet model, Plato offers a final image, the aviary model. Here, Plato is asking us to imagine the mind as a bird cage containing many kinds of birds. Now, in this, mind is no longer a wax tablet. Now, the mind is a bird cage, an aviary. The cage represents the mind and the birds in it represents the pieces of knowledge. When a person learns something, it is like acquiring a bird and placing it in the aviary. Teaching someone is like giving that person a bird. Now, when one needs to answer the question what is 1 plus 1 or 7 plus 5, the subject must reach into the aviary and catch the right bird, the bird namely representing 2 or 12. Notice now, a false belief becomes possible when the subject reaches into the aviary but catches the wrong bird. For example, the bird representing number 11. To find the answer of 7 plus 5, the mind is giving the answer number 11. This suggestion tries to address the problem left by the wax tablet model. In the aviary model, there is no need to match a present perception with pre-existing memory imprint. Now, aviary model tries to solve the problem that is left unresolved by the wax tablet model. However, the aviary model itself has a problem. It explains false belief by catching the wrong bird, but all the birds are initially supposed to be pieces of knowledge. And if every bird is knowledge, then even catching the wrong bird would still be the case of grasping knowledge. False belief would then be a strange kind of knowledge. Plato, therefore, wonders whether the aviary might also contain pieces of ignorance alongside pieces of knowledge. In that case, a person answering what is 7 plus 5 might catch the bird representing 11, while taking it to be the bird representing 12. The person would then judge falsely, believing that they know. However, this creates a further problem. How does the mind know whether the bird it has caught is a knowledge bird or an ignorance bird? To answer that question, we would need to posit another aviary to explain how the mind is distinguishing between knowledge birds and ignorance birds. But the same problem then arises again. The explanation threatens to repeat itself ad infinitum. With the failure of aviary model, all 5 attempts to show the possibility of false belief prove unsuccessful. Okay. Plato then directly refutes definition D2, that is, knowledge is true belief, through the example of juryman. Now, we have seen all the attempts to show how false belief is possible, and that false belief seems to have been impossible in all our options that we have gone through. Now, Plato shows how the definition D2 can be refuted directly. Now, he uses the example of a courtroom or a juryman example, it is called. His point is that a shrewd and a cunning lawyer may convince a jury to believe something that the jurors themselves have not witnessed. Their belief depends on persuasion rather than knowledge. They might be persuaded by the lawyer. The jury may therefore arrive at a true belief while still lacking the knowledge of the case, of the incident, because they have not witnessed the crime or whatever they are prosecuting the accused for. Therefore, true belief by itself is not sufficient for knowledge. So, the second definition fails as well. After the failure of second definition, Theaetetus makes a third attempt, and this is his final attempt. He defines knowledge, that is called D3, as true belief plus account or logos. Here, account or logos acts as an explanatory ground that turns true belief into knowledge. In modern epistemology, logos is often understood as justification that supports true belief and transforms it into knowledge. However, this definition is also challenged by Socrates. The dialogue ends without a final and accepted definition of knowledge. The discussion of this third definition centers around the meaning of account and logos, and it is developed through 4 sections, and it is as follows. First, is dream of Socrates. Second is logos as thought expressed through statement. Third, logos as enumeration of elements. Fourth, logos as differentiating formula. Let us begin with the dream of Socrates argument. According to this view, an account or logos, whenever I say logos, I mean the justification in modern epistemological terms or account from Platonic terms. According to this view, according to the Socratic dream, an account or logos describes what a thing itself is. The theory postulates that world is divided into two kinds of entities, complexes and simples. It is assumed that complexes can have logos because they are composed of simple elements and can be explained by reference to their simpler parts. Simple elements, on the other hand, cannot have logos. They can only be named. They cannot be analyzed or divided any further because they are simple parts. Even to say simple is or is not would add complexity to that simple. Notice the basic structure of this view. A complex thing can be known through an account of its parts, but a simple can only be directly apprehended or named. For this reason, the dream theory is kind of an epistemological atomism. A similar way of dividing world appears much later in analytic philosophy, especially in Russell's logical atomism, where Russell writes, and I quote, "I confess it seems obvious to me, as it did to Leibniz, that what is complex must be composed of simples." With this in mind, we can state the dream theory as follows. We know a complex X when we have a true belief about X together with the logos of X. Here, to have a logos of X means to analyze X into its simple elements. However, this theory leads to a problematic conclusion. This also creates its own problem. If knowledge is true belief about X together with an account of X's composition, then X can be known only if X is a complex. If X is not a complex, then X cannot be known. This problem is then extended into two separate dilemmas. We can understand them through an example from the dialogue itself. Take the syllable so from the name Socrates. So, that is S and O, which is the first two letters of Socrates. That's the first syllable of Socrates. Notice the syllable itself is complex and it can be understood in two ways. The syllable SO or so is either one, identical to the sum of its constituent letters S and O, or second, it is something more than the letters that make it up. Here in the first, the syllable SO or so is treated as nothing more than the sum of its elements, namely S and O. But if the syllable is only the combination of its two elements, then knowing the syllable would require knowing the elements from which it is composed. This is where dream theory faces its first difficulty. According to the theory itself, the simple elements cannot be known because they cannot be given a logos. That is the postulate we just saw earlier. They can only be named. Simples can only be named. Therefore, if so, the syllable so is nothing more than S and O, and if S and O themselves cannot be known because they are simples, then the syllable so, SO, cannot be known either. Notice, therefore, a complex cannot be known only by analyzing it into simple elements that themselves are unknowable. In the second dilemma, the syllable so is treated as something more than the sum of its elements, the simple elements. On this view, so, syllable so is more than S and O. it is a unified whole in its own right. But if the syllable is one unified whole, then it lacks an internal structure that can be analyzed into a relevant sense. As a result, it functions as a simple element. This creates the original problem. Simple elements cannot be known because they cannot be given a logos. Therefore, when the syllable so is understood as a single indivisible entity, it also falls outside the scope of logos. In this way, treating the complex as something more than its parts makes it resemble the simple elements that the theory itself places beyond knowledge. Okay, these two dilemmas falls into problem. Now notice one further feature of Socratic dream theory. It also applies to mathematics. Mathematicians begin from hypothetical first principles. In Greek, these are called stoicheia. Sometimes when principles are taken as given or considered intuitively certain because they cannot be wrong in our intuition. That's what mathematics starts with. For example, the postulates of Euclidean geometry or Descartes' cogito ergo sum or I think are claimed to be known through rational intuition. In modern science, axiomatic principles may also be understood as free mental creations, as Einstein puts. Yet, they remain hypothetical starting points. The problem is this: if these starting points cannot themselves be given a logos, then the conclusion derived from them cannot count as knowledge in Platonic sense. Mathematics here is placed in the court to prove the ultimate validity of its theorem, and it has no answer other than saying if the hypotheses are given, then by the laws of deduction the conclusion will follow necessarily from the premises, but it cannot by deduction alone establish the ultimate validity of its starting principles. However, the Socratic dream theory applies not only to mathematics, it also applies to physics and language. See the table to understand. Let us look at physics in general, where analysis proceeds by reducing complex phenomena to more basic constituents of physical reality, that is called reductionism. Early modern corpuscularian theories such as Robert Boyle's theory of corpuscles explained visible bodies in terms of smaller and smaller corpuscles. Later physical theories explained matter in terms of atoms, electrons, nuclei, and even more fundamental structures. In each case, science tries to explain the complex by discovering the simpler elements from which it is composed and through which it behaves. However, the dream theory raises a philosophical question. If our explanation rests on more basic elements currently known to us, what gives those elements their own logos? If they are merely accepted as final explanatory units of a theory, then they function like a simples of Socrates' dream. Notice that scientific and technological progress often occurs when what had been treated as simple is later shown to be complex when deeper explanatory structure is discovered. In this sense, the dream not only criticizes mathematics but also exposes a general problem for any analytic model of knowledge. The complex is explained by the simple, but the simple itself still demands more explanation, which we are not able to give because it's a simple. Finally, Socrates gives 3 further attempts to determine what knowledge is, because the dream theory has fallen apart. One of them understands logos as thought expressed through statements or speech, just like I'm speaking right now. But this is too weak. Anyone with a true belief and ability to speak can express that belief in words. Mere verbal expression cannot turn true belief into knowledge, because I am also speaking. I may be speaking anything. Another attempt to understand logos as an enumeration of elements, as when someone spells a name by listing its letters. But this also fails, because a person may correctly list the elements by accidents or mechanically without genuine knowledge. This attempt is, however, interesting because it can be extended to modern debates about artificial intelligence, especially John Searle's Chinese room argument. In the Chinese room, a machine may manipulate Chinese symbols according to the rules and produce correct answers without understanding any Chinese language. Similarly, a person may correctly enumerate elements of a thing, such as the letters of a name, without genuinely knowing what he is doing. In both cases, the problem is the same, that is, correct performance does not by itself amount to understanding. The possession or production of right sequence of elements is not yet knowledge. His final attempt, now we are at the final attempt. His final attempt to define knowledge identifies logos as the differentiating mark of a thing, that is, what makes one thing different from everything else. This is the strongest account of logos, but it becomes viciously circular. Take an example. Suppose I have a true belief about someone, say Jawaharlal Nehru. To turn that true belief into knowledge, I must be able to say what makes Nehru Nehru. Okay, let me say that again. To turn that true belief into knowledge, I must be able to say what makes Nehru Nehru rather than Gandhi or anyone else. So, logos here means the ability to identify an object by its unique differentiating mark. But notice the problem. If I already have a true belief about Nehru, then I must be able to judge Nehru as Nehru. That means I must already have understanding of what differentiates him from others. Therefore, adding the differentiating mark does not add a new condition to belief. Okay? Adding a differentiating mark does not add a new condition to the true belief. It only repeats something that is already presupposed in having the true belief. This becomes viciously circular. And with this failure of the last attempt, the last definition, that is D3, that is knowledge is true belief plus some account or logos, ends in failure. Let me conclude now. In conclusion, Theaetetus is aporetic. It ends without arriving at a satisfactory definition of knowledge. However, I want to consider one influential scholarly interpretation that reads the dialogue differently. The dream theory tries to ground knowledge in primary elements, that interpretation says, as though analysis could terminate in simple units that require no further account. On that scholarly interpretation, Plato rejects that model. Knowledge cannot be built from unknowable simples, as in the foundationalist model that begins with basic units, such as Russell's sense datum analysis or Descartes' cogito principle. Instead, knowledge is interrelational. To know something is to grasp its place within the structured field of relations. For example, a letter is known through its place or function in syllable or words. A musical note is known through its relation to other notes. In this sense, knowledge is practical and systematic. It consists in the disciplined ability to locate, connect, and explain elements within a field. Therefore, on this interpretation, Plato moves away from foundationalist model of knowledge and toward a more holistic and pragmatically oriented model of understanding. With that, I take your leave. Thank you.